August 1945. The war that had seemed eternal for the Japanese Empire ended in silence, not with the roar of victory. In Manila, Guam, and scattered islands across the Pacific, Japanese troops lowered their rifles and raised their hands. Among them were women, nurses in white uniforms stained with mud, clerks who had worked in military offices, interpreters, even a few communications operators. They were rare, but they existed, and they shared one thing: fear of what came next. Propaganda had painted the Americans as monsters. Women had been told stories of brutality, of humiliation, of endless torment if captured. For months, those warnings had lived in their minds like ghosts. Surrender was supposed to be worse than death. Yet, as the days of August unfolded, they found themselves herded into orderly lines, guarded but not beaten, counted and processed like soldiers, not prey. One of them was a 23-year-old nurse named Aiko. She had served at a field hospital on Luzon, treating wounds with dwindling supplies, often improvising bandages from shredded uniforms. She remembered the whispers in the ward as the surrender orders came. Americans will show no mercy. When the trucks arrived, she braced for blows. Instead, an American sergeant simply gestured, "On the truck," his voice stern but not cruel. She climbed aboard, clutching her satchel as if it contained her life. The convoy rolled past shattered villages, children watching with wide eyes, stray dogs trailing behind. The air smelled of smoke and wet earth. Aiko glanced at the soldiers who rode beside them. They were young, some younger than her brothers. Their helmets were tilted back, their rifles slung lazily. One even shared a cigarette with another guard and laughed at a joke she could not understand. These are not demons, she thought, confused. They are boys. The journey to the camp took hours, sometimes days. Women sat shoulder to shoulder, silent, their fear pressing heavier than the humid air. Every bump in the road jolted them forward. Every pause filled them with dread. But the dread never became violence. The trucks stopped. Food was passed out. Cans of meat, bread, even fruit. Some women refused at first, convinced it was a trick. Hunger won. One by one, they ate. Surprised by the taste. Real bread, soft, warm. Nothing like the brittle rice cakes they had clung to in the last weeks. The camp itself was not what they imagined. Behind barbed wire were rows of tents, neatly aligned. Wooden watchtowers stood at the corners, but guards leaned casually, not brandishing whips. Water tanks glistened in the sun. Latrines had been dug with precision. It looked less like a dungeon and more like a small temporary town, an odd, unsettling town of defeat. Inside, order ruled. Prisoners were registered, given numbers, checked by medics. Some women received shots against disease, something they had not expected. Aiko watched as an American medic, a man with freckles and tired eyes, disinfected her arm before inserting the needle. He whistled softly, a tune she did not know. The sound was so ordinary it stunned her. A man humming while giving care, she thought, even to an enemy. Fear lingered, but slowly it mixed with confusion. Instead of the cruelty they had braced for, they met routines. Meals came on schedule. Guards barked commands, but the commands were about lining up, moving to the mess hall, or keeping sanitation. No hands struck them. No insults were spat in their faces. The first night was the strangest. Women lay on thin mattresses under canvas roofs, listening for the cries of pain they had been promised in propaganda. Instead, they heard the distant murmur of American soldiers talking, the buzz of a generator, and faint laughter from somewhere beyond the wire. The laughter cut deeper than any whip. It was not aimed at them. It was simply life continuing, indifferent to their fears. That indifference was shocking. Morning brought drills, not military, but organizational. Groups were led to wash stations, others to medical tents. Aiko saw women with festering wounds cleaned and bandaged. Supplies seemed endless. Rolls of gauze, bottles of medicine, crates stamped with U.S. Army markings. She remembered the shortages back home, the endless improvisation. Here, bandages were discarded after one use. The waste appalled her, but the abundance was undeniable. Language was the next barrier. Some women spoke fragments of English, learned from school books or overheard from missionaries before the war. Others relied on gestures. One interpreter, a former secretary named Keiko, tried to bridge the gulf. She explained rules to her fellow prisoners, often stumbling, but always trying. One day, an American guard handed her a notebook and pencil, saying slowly, "You write, I help." It was the first time she realized that communication was not a weapon, but a bridge. And yet, suspicion lingered. Every kindness felt like bait. Every smile seemed too soft, too calculated. At night, the women whispered to each other, "It is only the beginning. They will show their true faces later." Fear is hard to kill, even when evidence says otherwise. But the evidence grew. Cigarettes were distributed, sometimes chocolate. Soap was given out, along with instructions for hygiene. When one woman coughed violently, an American guard fetched a medic himself. The guard returned with medicine in hand, placing it gently beside her bed. She could only stare, bewildered. Why help us? The question echoed in every corner of the camp. The defining shock came not with food, nor medicine, nor silence. It came with something far stranger. One afternoon, guards set up a large white sheet in an open area. Behind it, a machine hummed. Prisoners gathered, murmuring, unsure of what was happening. Aiko sat cross-legged with dozens of others, the sun dipping low behind the wire. Then, as dusk fell, a beam of light cut the darkness. Shadows flickered. Images danced on the sheet. The women gasped. They were watching moving pictures. A film. The first screening was chaos wrapped in silence. The women sat stiffly, knees drawn up, arms crossed tight against their bodies, as if bracing for an ambush. The projector clattered, the reel spun, and suddenly an American newsreel appeared on the sheet. Music blared tinny and bold, trumpets rising like an army of sound. Aiko flinched at the noise. Beside her, Keiko squinted at the flashing images. Smiling soldiers, waving civilians, endless lines of trucks rolling across wide American highways. For most, it was the first time they had seen America not as a caricature in a propaganda poster, but as living faces, gestures, smiles, children with balloons, women in bright dresses walking down streets untouched by war. For women who had grown up under years of rationing, blackouts, and air raid drills, the images felt like glimpses of another planet. Was this the enemy? Laughter erupted at unexpected moments. A short comedy followed the newsreel. Slapstick, with a man slipping on a banana peel and tumbling into a fountain. At first, the Japanese women sat stone-faced. Then a giggle escaped one throat. Another joined. Soon an awkward ripple of laughter spread through the group. They laughed at a foreign joke in a foreign tongue, not understanding the words but recognizing the stumble, the pratfall, the universal absurdity of someone falling headfirst into water. That night as they lay in their tents, the women whispered about the pictures. "Did you see the shops?" one asked. "Shelves full of food." Another shook her head. "The children, they were fat." For them, fat children were not symbols of indulgence but of plenty, of security. In war-torn Japan, children's faces had been hollow, their limbs stick-thin. Seeing abundance projected in moving light was both awe-inspiring and cruel. The screenings became regular, almost weekly. Each time, guards herded the prisoners to the open area as dusk fell. Sometimes it was comedies, sometimes musicals, sometimes short news features. The projector light carved a hole in the night. The women came to expect it. even anticipated, though none admitted it aloud. During the day, life in camp found rhythm. Roll call at dawn, breakfast, oatmeal or bread, sometimes eggs. Work details for those healthy enough, cleaning, cooking, maintaining the camp's order. Medical checkups continued. Many women had been malnourished, suffering from anemia, dysentery, infections. American doctors treated them systematically, using supplies that seemed endless. Penicillin appeared, almost miraculous to women who had seen men die from wounds that refused to heal. Aiko volunteered at the infirmary, partly out of habit, partly out of curiosity. She assisted American nurses who showed her techniques she had never seen, sterilizing instruments, using rubber gloves, measuring doses with precision. She realized with a jolt that these nurses treated her not as a prisoner, but as a colleague. They corrected her gently, smiled at her clumsy English, even laughed with her at small mistakes. It was not equality, but it was not cruelty either. Meals were another revelation. They came with monotonous regularity, but the contents shocked the women. Coffee, bitter and black, often spat out at first taste. Canned peaches, golden slices swimming in syrup, sweeter than anything they had tasted since childhood. Bread that was soft, almost too soft, compared to the coarse loaves of home. One woman whispered, "If this is captivity, what is freedom?" It was a bitter joke, but it carried weight. At night, the movies continued their quiet work. The women saw musicals with sequined costumes, dancing lines of chorus girls, men in tuxedos, singing with impossible smiles. For prisoners who had expected interrogation and punishment, the spectacle was surreal. One whispered after a show, "They want us to envy them." Another replied, "No, they want us to see them." Both were right. Keiko, the interpreter, began scribbling English words in her notebook during screenings. She asked guards the meaning of phrases. Home, victory, freedom. She repeated them softly, tasting them like new food. Other women followed, repeating words that floated from the projector's speakers. Soon, fragments of English peppered their conversations, not with fluency, but with curiosity. The guards noticed. One night, before a screening, an American sergeant deliberately chose a reel with subtitles. He pointed, smiling, as the women leaned forward to read. "See?" he said, tapping the English text. Keiko translated his gesture. "He wants us to learn." It was not an order. It was an invitation. The contrast with propaganda back home grew sharper each week. In Japan, films had been stern, nationalistic, filled with soldiers dying noble deaths, women sacrificing for the emperor, children singing patriotic songs. In the camp, the films were about ordinary life, a boy delivering newspapers, a girl falling in love at a county fair, men stumbling over furniture in a comedy routine. It was not triumph or glory, it was normalcy. For women raised on sacrifice, normal life was the most foreign film of all. Aiko remembered one screening in particular, a film about a family sitting around a dinner table, laughing, eating roast chicken. She stared, transfixed. For her, meals had been rations, hurried, solemn, eaten under blackout curtains. The film's dinner scene was nothing short of revolutionary. She whispered, "Is this how they live every day?" The thought was more unsettling than the barbed wire around her. In the mess tent, conversations shifted. At first, women spoke of survival, of home, of shame. Slowly, the talk turned to films, to songs heard faintly. Another mused, "Maybe that's why they fight so differently. They fight to go back to that life." The movies became a paradox. They were entertainment, distraction, propaganda, and revelation all at once. They soothed, but they also unsettled. For the first time, the women saw America not as faceless enemies, but as a place where children laughed and people danced. The shock was not in cruelty withheld, but in humanity revealed. The projector itself became a symbol. At night, when the reels ended, women sat in silence for a moment longer, staring at the sheet, even after the light died. It was as if they hoped the images would linger, that America would not vanish into darkness. Then the guards called them back to barracks and reality returned. Barbed wire, tents, captivity. But in their minds, a new world had begun to take shape. One evening after a screening of a Chaplin comedy, Aiko turned to Keiko and whispered, "They do not show us power. They show us laughter." Keiko nodded, her pencil poised over her notebook. Maybe laughter is their power. That was the first time many of them realized that the war they had lost was not only fought with guns and bombs. It was also fought with images, with stories, with culture. The screen inside the camp was brighter in its own way than any weapon they had ever faced. The second screening was different. By now the women had learned the routine. At dusk, guards stretched a white sheet taut between poles. The projector was rolled out and benches were dragged into rows. But this time the crowd was larger. Not only Japanese women, but also a few captured nurses from other nations sat together, guarded but not harassed. The sky above burned with fading light, and the smell of diesel mixed with the faint sweetness of canned fruit drifting from the mess hall. The camp settled into an expectant hush. Aiko sat near the back, her knees pulled close to her chest. She had not slept the night before. She thought of home, of her younger brother in Hiroshima, and of the silence that had followed the bomb she had only heard rumors about. Tonight, she expected more propaganda, more reminders of defeat. Instead, she saw something entirely foreign. The reel flickered, the projector whirred, and color filled the sheet. Not newsreels, not soldiers. It was a Hollywood musical. Women in sequined gowns danced across the screen, their movements precise, joyful, utterly free. Men in tuxedos sang with booming voices, smiling as if the world had never known hunger or fear. Trumpets blared, violins soared, and the rhythm seemed to lift the air itself. The Japanese women stared in silence. They had never seen women dressed like that. Bare shoulders, bright makeup, shining shoes. In Japan, wartime films had shown women as dutiful, somber, self-sacrificing. Here, women danced with abandon, their laughter echoing even through the scratchy projector speakers. Keiko leaned forward, translating scraps of lyrics as best she could. Love, dream, together. Her voice trembled. For women who had lived years under slogans of sacrifice for the emperor and glory in death, these words were almost blasphemy. To live for love? For dreams? It was shocking. One of the younger prisoners began to laugh, covering her mouth in embarrassment. Another whispered, "Impossible. This cannot be real." But the screen did not lie. The women kept dancing, kept smiling, kept singing. The performance was endless. A flood of joy projected into the prison yard. Tears followed laughter. One nurse, her hands trembling, began to cry quietly. "Why show us this?" she whispered. "Do they mock us?" But her voice held no anger, only confusion. For her, the film was not mockery but revelation, a reminder of a world beyond war, a world where joy itself was a weapon. Aiko could not take her eyes off the leading lady. She twirled in a sparkling dress, her hair flowing, her eyes filled with a kind of light Aiko had never seen. She thought of her own uniform, stained with blood, her hair cut short for practicality, her face lined with exhaustion. The woman on screen seemed like a creature from another universe. Aiko's heart pounded. Is this what freedom looks like? The guards watched too, though differently. They lounged on the edges, smoking cigarettes, some chuckling at familiar jokes. For them, the film was a reminder of home, a slice of America carried into the dust of captivity. They likely never imagined the impact it had on the prisoners. To the Americans, it was entertainment. To the Japanese women, It was a cultural earthquake. When the film ended, silence lingered. The projector lights sputtered out, the screen turned blank. But no one moved. For a few seconds it was as if the camp did not exist. Only the memory of sequins, trumpets, and voices singing of dreams. Then the guards barked. "Back to barracks!" The women shuffled away, but their eyes glowed with something unspoken. That night the camp buzzed with whispers. Some women replayed scenes in detail. "Did you see the fountain? The way the lights sparkled?" Others argued. One muttered, "It was a lie. America cannot be like that." But another countered, "It must be real. How else could they make it?" The debate spread, not about war or surrender, but about music, dresses, laughter. It was as if the film had shifted the axis of their world. Ayako lay awake, staring at the canvas roof. She heard footsteps of guards outside, the hum of a distant generator and the faint echo of trumpets still ringing in her ears. She whispered to herself, "Dream, love, together." Words she barely understood, but words that cut through the silence like light through cloth. In the following days, the women began to imitate what they had seen. Some hummed the tunes, even off-key. Others tried to mimic the dances, shyly twirling in the dirt, their bare feet stumbling but determined. Laughter followed, and for the first time in weeks, the camp felt alive with something more than fear. Even the guards noticed. One chuckled, calling out, "Hollywood in the camp!" The prisoners blushed, but did not stop. For women who had been raised under discipline and silence, these small acts were rebellions, not against the Americans, but against the prison inside themselves, against fear, against propaganda that had told them the enemy was savage. The films did not erase captivity, but they bent it into something unexpected. Letters through the Red Cross carried fragments of this shock. One prisoner wrote, "We were shown moving pictures, not of war, but of life. I do not know if I should believe what I saw." Another wrote more simply, "They let us watch laughter." For families back home, such lines must have seemed unbelievable. Yet they were true. The cultural gap widened with each screening. The women realized that America was not only stronger in weapons, but richer in spirit. They had defeated Japan not only with bombers and fleets, but with movies, songs, and the ability to laugh even in war. Aiko felt this most of all. One evening, as the camp settled into darkness, she whispered to Keiko, "We lost to their machines, but perhaps we also lost to their dreams." That realization was more terrifying than guns, and more liberating. Morning in the camp began with roll call, the clang of a bell, the shuffle of boots on packed earth. But conversation no longer circled only around food rations or fear of interrogation. Now, whispers carried fragments of songs, awkwardly hummed phrases lifted from the films. The women had never imagined such a transformation. A prison camp, defined by barbed wire, had become a theater, its stage a white sheet, its audience bewildered prisoners of war. Aiko noticed the change in herself. She still moved cautiously, still lowered her gaze when guards passed, but her nights were no longer haunted only by explosions and screams. They were haunted, too, by color, sound, and laughter. She replayed the image of the woman in the sparkling gown, twirling across the screen, free from fear. For Aiko, that single twirl was more dangerous than any rifle. It planted an idea that life could be lived differently. Ideas, once planted, do not vanish. Keiko, the interpreter, became the unofficial chronicler of these shocks. Each screening, she scribbled notes in her thin notebook, not just words, but impressions. "Their women laugh," she wrote after one musical. "Ours endure." She drew small sketches, shoes with high heels, hats with feathers, smiles that seemed to shine brighter than electric lamps. To her fellow prisoners, Keiko's notebook became proof that the world outside war was real, even if unreachable. The contrast with Japan was brutal. Before capture, most of the women had known only films filled with sacrifice. They remembered reels where mothers sent sons to the front with proud tears, where soldiers vowed to die rather than surrender. The stories always ended with death framed as glory. But in the camp, the films ended with marriages, with songs, with laughter. Instead of endings carved in tragedy, these stories ended in light. One nurse, Harumi, confessed to Aiko one evening, "In our films, we die beautifully. In theirs, they live simply. Which is stronger?" Her question lingered. None had an answer, but all felt the shift. Beauty in death was suddenly smaller than joy in life. The guards never lectured them. They never explained the meaning of the films. They simply let the reels play. The effect was more powerful than any speech. To show is stronger than to tell. For some women, the shock was unbearable. A few turned away, muttering that the films were lies. "This is not real America," one insisted. "They show us illusions." But her words sounded weaker each week. The abundance on the screen matched the abundance in the camp's kitchens. The smiles on the screen mirrored the casual smiles of the guards. It was hard to call both illusion. There was another difference. In Japanese propaganda, the enemy was always faceless, often grotesque caricatures. Americans drawn as monsters, their culture painted as degenerate. But here, in the light of the projector, the enemy had faces, songs, and gestures of kindness. The cognitive dissonance was painful. The propaganda in their memories cracked like glass under pressure. One of the younger women, a clerk from Saipan, whispered after a screening, "If this is America, then why did we hate them so much?" It was not defiance. It was despair. She had grown up believing hatred was duty. Now she saw that duty had been built on shadows. Letters that left the camp began to carry hints of this transformation. Of course, censorship cut most of the detail, but fragments slipped through. "We are treated with order and strange kindness," one wrote. Another, bolder, confessed, "They even show us moving pictures." For families in Japan, those words must have sounded impossible. Yet they were true, carried across oceans like fragile seeds of a new reality. The shock was not limited to films. It spread into daily interactions. Women who had once avoided eye contact with guards now dared to ask questions. "What is that?" one asked, pointing at a chocolate bar. "How do you eat it?" Guards, sometimes amused, sometimes patient, shared pieces. Laughter followed. Clumsy words were exchanged. The gulf between captor and captive narrowed, if only for a heartbeat. Aiko herself experienced one of these moments. She was helping in the infirmary when an American nurse offered her a cup of coffee. The taste was bitter, overwhelming. She gagged, nearly spit it out. The nurse laughed gently and handed her sugar. "Better," she said in halting Japanese. Aiko tried again. Sweetness softened the bitterness. She smiled. The nurse smiled back. That smile lingered longer in her memory than the taste. Small gestures break walls. The contrast deepened when the women remembered their last days before capture. Hunger had been constant, fear unending. Cities burned, rice was scarce, families were scattered. In the camp, food was routine, medicine abundant, orders strict but not cruel. And now, movies. Windows into a life unscarred by war. The difference was not just cultural. It was existential. One night, Keiko whispered as the women lay in the barracks, "If they had shown us this before the war, would we still have fought?" Silence followed. The question was too large, too late. But all knew the answer pressing in their hearts. Images could have broken chains that slogans could not. Harumi, The nurse who had asked about beauty and strength found herself changing. She began humming American tunes while she worked. She mimicked the dance steps, awkward but earnest. Others joined. Soon laughter echoed in the mess hall, not because of guards, but because prisoners danced like clowns, parodying the musicals they had seen. But the parody carried longing. Even mockery was imitation, and imitation is the first step to belief. The irony struck some like a cruel joke. They had been captured, stripped of freedom, placed behind wire, yet here they found glimpses of freedom in shadows cast on a sheet, freedom projected in light. The paradox was unbearable and yet undeniable. Aiko summed it up one evening, whispering to Keiko, "They cage us with wire, but they free us with pictures." Keiko wrote the words in her notebook, underlining them twice. It was not poetry, it was testimony. The cultural shock of those nights changed the rhythm of captivity. Where once days dragged endlessly, now the week had anticipation. Women counted the days to the next screening. They dressed as neatly as possible, smoothing their worn uniforms, braiding their hair, preparing to sit before the white screen as if attending a festival. The irony was sharp. Captivity had given them something to look forward to. This shock was not only personal, it was strategic, though perhaps unintentionally so. American authorities understood that culture could soften captives, reduce tension, and even influence hearts. They may not have grasped the depth of impact, but they had opened a door. Through that door, the women saw a world they had been told did not exist. By winter, the films were no longer strange. They were expected. Laughter in the camp became normal. Arguments no longer circled only around ration sizes, but around which film had been funniest, which actor had smiled the brightest, which song refused to leave their minds. Barbed wire still held their bodies, but images had stolen their thoughts. Aiko lay awake one night, the barracks silent except for the breathing of dozens of women. She replayed the reel in her mind. Soldiers had told her once that death was duty. But tonight she remembered the woman in sequins, twirling in light, singing of love. Aiko whispered to herself, "We died for duty. They live for love. Which wins?" That was the ultimate shock. Not the projector, not the laughter, but the realization that the foundation of their beliefs had cracked under the weight of images. Propaganda was iron, movies were water, and water always finds a way. The projector did not just cast light on a sheet, it cast shadows on memory. Each reel clashed with years of slogans, posters, and wartime films the women had grown up with. That clash was the deepest shock of captivity. Not hunger, not confinement, but the fracture between what they had been told and what they now saw with their own eyes. In Japan, posters had shown Americans as beasts. Their teeth exaggerated, their eyes savage, their hands dripping with blood. Schoolgirls were taught to expect torture, to imagine that surrender meant fates worse than death. Women had memorized slogans. Better to die than be captured. Those phrases clung like armor. Now the armor cracked. The guards who handed out bread did not leer. The nurses who bandaged wounds did not sneer. And the men who set up projectors did not beat them. They laughed. Aiko remembered a propaganda film shown in 1944. It depicted an American soldier storming a house, tearing children from their mother's arms, setting fire to a shrine. The women in her unit had whispered then, "We must never fall into their hands." That memory returned as she watched a Hollywood comedy where an American soldier slipped on ice, helped an old lady cross the street, and grinned sheepishly. The contrast was violent. Two images of America, one monstrous, one human, warred in her mind. Which to believe? Keiko's notebook filled with comparisons. On one page, she copied a Japanese slogan, "Americans are devils." On the opposite page, she sketched the smiling face of a tap-dancing actor from a musical. Beneath it she wrote, "Devils do not dance." Her fellow prisoners laughed when they saw it, but the laughter carried nervousness. They were laughing at their own crumbling beliefs. The Red Cross allowed censored letters. Women seized the chance. Aiko wrote home, "I am alive. I have food. We are even shown moving pictures." She knew the censors might cut that line, but she risked it anyway. To her, the sentence was not only information, it was defiance. Defiance against the lies she had once believed. Another woman, Harumi, described in her letter, "They show us stories of families at dinner. Not propaganda, just life. It makes me wonder what else we were told that was false." The letter never reached her family, but in writing it, she admitted what she had never dared speak aloud, that trust in her nation's stories was breaking. The dissonance seeped into daily conversations. "Why did they tell us lies?" one woman asked in the mess tent. Another replied, "Because if we knew the truth, we would never have fought." It was a dangerous thought, yet captivity allowed it. Barbed wire separated them from their homeland, but the projectors separated them from illusions. Propaganda had demanded silence, obedience, sacrifice. Reality offered noise, questions, abundance. Even the meals in the camp undermined years of slogans. Women had been taught that America was decadent, collapsing under corruption, yet each morning brought bread, butter, coffee. Each week brought screenings of films filled with laughter. Decadence looked strangely like plenty. Corruption tasted strangely like sugar. The shock was not only political, it was personal. One woman confessed to Aiko, "All my life I hated what I did not know, and now I am ashamed." Shame spread quietly, but it was real. They realized hatred had been manufactured, poured into them like rationed rice. Now, in captivity, they tasted something different. The guards did not preach democracy. They did not distribute pamphlets. They simply let the films roll. But those films became sermons in themselves. A dance sequence preached abundance. A love story preached freedom. A slapstick fall preached laughter. Each scene chipped away at years of indoctrination. At night in the barracks, women began retelling scenes the way they had once retold nationalist slogans. "Do you remember the man who tried to juggle and dropped everything?" One laughed. Another added, "Or the girl who sang in the rain." These were not just memories of entertainment. They were acts of replacement. Old propaganda was being overwritten by new images. Aiko noticed her own dreams changing. Once she dreamed of battlefields, of endless wounded, of emperor portraits hanging on hospital walls. Now she dreamed of bright streets, of women in dresses twirling under neon lights. She woke, confused, ashamed, and yet oddly comforted. Dreams, too, had become battlegrounds. The shock became most visible during a screening of a war film, an American production, showing soldiers writing letters home, longing for wives and children. The Japanese women expected arrogance, perhaps mockery. Instead, they saw loneliness. Men sat in foxholes reading letters, their faces tired, their hands dirty, their voices cracking as they whispered to themselves. It was war, stripped of glory. For women raised on images of heroic death, this was staggering. Americans admitted weakness. That weakness looked strangely like strength. One prisoner whispered after the film, "They fight to return home. We fought to never return. Which is right?" The camp fell into silence. No one answered. The question hung heavier than the barbed wire. Propaganda thrives in isolation, but the camp was not isolation. It was exposure. Exposure to food, medicine, conversation, and movies. Every detail of life in captivity contradicted the myths of home. And with each contradiction, belief eroded. By winter, the women had stopped repeating slogans in private. No one said, "Better to die than surrender." No one spoke of Americans as monsters. Instead, they debated films, sang snatches of songs, imitated actors' gestures. The transformation was complete, not imposed but absorbed. Keiko summed it up in her notebook. We feared whips. They gave us pictures. Pictures broke what whips could not. The night the first musical film flickered across the camp projector, the air itself seemed to shift. Prisoners who had grown used to silence and rationed words sat stunned as a flood of music poured into their world. It wasn't drums for marching or bugles for battle, but strings and brass that laughed, danced, and wept all at once. Keiko sat with her back straight, hands folded in her lap. She expected propaganda, some trick designed to mock them. Instead, she heard the opening chords of a Broadway-style number. A line of dancers appeared, their feet tapping in perfect rhythm. The sound was alien, and yet it carried warmth. Music is dangerous, she whispered to herself, echoing what Japanese teachers once told her. But she realized in that moment, danger could feel like relief. In Japan, women had been told that laughter was weakness, that joy was frivolous. Every film they'd seen at home praised sacrifice, discipline, death. And now, here in captivity, they saw men trip over chairs, women whirl in sparkling dresses, and entire crowds burst into song for no reason other than happiness. The prisoners looked at one another, confused. Then nervous smiles spread. The dam cracked. Laughter slipped out, hesitant at first, then fuller. And when the projector light dimmed, silence did not return. The sound of muffled giggles lingered like an aftertaste of freedom. Aiko confessed later in her diary, I had forgotten what laughter sounded like in a room of women. It rose from our stomachs, not from duty. For years we laughed only when told to laugh. Now we laughed because it hurt not to. The guards noticed the change. They saw women leaving the screenings with brighter eyes, humming bits of unfamiliar tunes. One officer, Sergeant Miller, recalled in a letter to his wife, these girls walked out singing words they didn't understand. Music doesn't need a dictionary. It went straight to them. He shook his head, wondering what kind of power a simple melody carried. There was one night that every survivor remembered. The film was Yankee Doodle Dandy. When James Cagney launched into his tap dance routine, the prisoners gasped. No one had ever moved like that. The rhythm was military in its precision, but playful in its heart. To women raised on the stiff formalities of no and kabuki, this looked like rebellion wrapped in grace. By the second chorus, one woman clapped along, others followed. For the first time in years, the camp thundered with applause. Harumi, who had once served as a nurse in Manchuria, wrote later, I thought America had only machines and guns, but that night I saw that they also had rhythm. They could turn feet into drums, laughter into courage. The music didn't stay locked to the screen. It spilled into the barracks. Women imitated dance steps, tapping feet against wooden floors, twirling ragged skirts in the dim light. Guards sometimes smiled and shook their heads, pretending not to see. But they saw enough to realize the camp had changed. Music had done what sermons could not. It had dissolved despair. There was another film, Singin' in the Rain, screened after the war ended, but while women were still in captivity. The prisoners watched Gene Kelly dance with an umbrella, rain splashing with joy instead of misery. The irony struck them deeply. Rain in their world had meant mud, disease, and misery. In his world, rain became a partner in happiness. Some women wept openly. Aiko whispered through her tears, I didn't know rain could be kind. The guards gave out harmonicas, old instruments collected from Red Cross boxes. Soon, at night, faint melodies rose from the huts. At first, they were halting, awkward, then stronger. One prisoner played a tune she remembered from a film, a swing riff, clumsy but recognizable. Others hummed along, their voices carrying fragments of a culture they had once been told to hate. Music blurred the barbed wire. Letters home carried fragments of this shock. Aiko wrote, "They make us watch stories with music. We did not expect this. At home we were told America had no soul, only machines. But their songs are filled with soul." Another woman described the comedy shorts. A man threw a pie in another man's face. We screamed with laughter. Imagine writing this in a letter from a camp. But it is true. The tears were as important as the laughter. Films about families, about love interrupted by war, cut deeply. Many women broke down, realizing how much they missed home. For the first time, they admitted grief aloud. "The screen unlocked our tears," Harumi explained. "We did not even cry when captured. We cried when we saw mothers holding children in movies." Propaganda had trained them to deny vulnerability. The projector taught them it was allowed, in a place where they were powerless. Music and laughter gave them something stronger than control. It gave them release. One American medic recalled walking past a hut one evening. Inside, a dozen women sat together, softly humming a tune from Over the Rainbow. None of them knew the words, but the melody floated, fragile yet unbreakable. He stopped, listened, and wrote in his journal, "They found hope in a song. That is how wars truly end." The transformation was not total. Suspicion lingered. Some women refused to attend screenings, muttering that it was another trick. But even they could not escape the melodies carried through camp. Resistance cracked, not by force, but by repetition. Night after night, reel after reel, comedy after comedy, the old slogans grew fainter. By spring, the prisoners had absorbed enough to recognize actors, even favorites. They spoke names aloud: Chaplin, Cagney, Astaire, as if they were familiar relatives. The very act of recognition was rebellion against propaganda, which had taught them to deny American humanity. Recognition meant acceptance. And always there was the rhythm: shoes tapping, voices humming, laughter rising. In a place built to confine, sound became liberation. Harumi summed it up years later when interviewed in Tokyo. "We were not freed by food or medicine alone. We were freed by laughter." That was the wound America healed without knowing. The first letters were cautious, written in cramped Japanese script on Red Cross stationery, censored by American officers, but allowed to pass. The women who had seen movies in camp described them carefully, almost timidly. They were afraid their families wouldn't believe them. And yet, they couldn't help but include the detail that shocked them most. They showed us moving pictures, comedies, with music. Back home, these words landed like lightning. Families who expected tales of cruelty read lines about laughter, about Chaplin, about Gene Kelly dancing in the rain. The contrast was dizzying. Japan's wartime propaganda had painted Americans as brutal and heartless, animals with machines, but no culture. To hear from daughters and sisters that Americans handed out popcorn, screened comedies, and allowed prisoners to laugh felt almost impossible. One mother whispered to a neighbor, "She must be confused. Prisoners don't laugh." Yet the letter was real, the handwriting unmistakable. Keiko wrote her parents in Kyoto. "We sat in a hall. A great light shone. We saw faces move, dance, sing. I laughed until I cried. I thought I would never laugh again." Her father, a stern veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, read the words 3 times. His world tilted. He had lost sons on Pacific Islands. He had believed every word of the Emperor's broadcasts about the enemy's cruelty. But now his daughter described a guard handing her candy before a film. He set the letter down and muttered, "So this is also war." Each letter was a small crack in the wall of belief, and like hairline fractures in glass they spread, impossible to contain. Neighbors gathered quietly to read them. Priests saw them during confessions. Some were smuggled into schools, whispered among students who had never known anything but slogans and drills. The words carried something more dangerous than bombs: doubt. Harumi's letter to her sister told a story that bordered on fantasy. She described a screening of The Wizard of Oz. There was a girl with red shoes. She walked a yellow road. There was a lion, a scarecrow, a man of tin. They all sang together. I wanted to close my ears, but I couldn't. The music held me. I forgot I was in camp. I thought I was a child again. Her sister read the letter aloud to a small group of neighbors. Some laughed nervously, others frowned. "Surely she is being tricked," one man said. "Americans do this to weaken them." Yet another, a farmer whose son had been drafted and lost, asked quietly, "But what if it is true?" American censors allowed these letters because they contained no military information. They did not realize how subversive the details would be once they reached Japanese soil. A prisoner describing a movie seemed harmless, but in a society where propaganda had crushed imagination, a single word about laughter or dancing pierced like a blade. A diary kept by Aiko, later published in fragments, captured the struggle inside her own mind. "If I write too much, my parents will think I am lying. If I write too little, I will explode from silence. So I choose one scene. A man slipped on a banana peel. We screamed with laughter. I write this down. I seal the letter, and then I wonder, will they believe their daughter or the empire?" The effect was cumulative. Hundreds of letters, thousands of sentences, scattered like seeds across Japan. They carried images of things ordinary citizens had never seen. Prisoners humming swing tunes, prisoners clapping at comedy reels, prisoners eating ice cream during an intermission. These images planted a different kind of future, one where the enemy was not a faceless beast, but a people with a strange, vibrant culture. It was not always received with joy. Some families felt shame. "How could you laugh while we suffer?" one relative scolded. Others felt anger, believing the women had been broken, converted into propaganda tools. Yet even those responses betrayed something profound. Acknowledgement that the women had seen something real, something powerful enough to disturb the rigid image of the enemy. In the camps themselves, the act of writing became liberation. The women realized they could carry fragments of America back home, not just in memory, but in ink. They described not only the films, but the way guards tapped their feet, the way music softened evenings, the way tears came without punishment. "I do not know if this is freedom," Harumi wrote in one letter, "but it is a taste of it." A young woman named Tomiko added something startling in her note. "We were told America had no heart, but I saw men weep during a film. They cried for things that were not even their own. That is heart." Her father, a stern bureaucrat, read the line in disbelief. His son had been lost at sea, yet his daughter described kindness in the enemy. The words haunted him. He confessed later that it was the first time he doubted the broadcasts blaring from Tokyo. The long echo of these letters reached far beyond their immediate readers. After the war, historians traced how POW correspondence softened some Japanese communities' acceptance of occupation. They found villages where returning women were not treated as outcasts, but as strange messengers. Their credibility was not always honored, but their words were remembered. It was like holding two mirrors, one villager recalled decades later. In one mirror, we saw the enemy as the state painted them. In the other, we saw them as our daughters described. We could not reconcile both, so we began to doubt the mirror itself. The letters also gave the women themselves a fragile sense of agency. To describe joy in captivity was to reclaim humanity. They had lost power, freedom, homeland, but in choosing which scenes to record, the pie fight, the umbrella dance, the song that made them cry, they shaped how their story would be remembered. Their captors did not silence them. They gave them ink, paper, and postage. That was enough. An American chaplain noticed how seriously they took the ritual. He wrote in his diary, Each woman bent over her paper like it was sacred. They weren't just writing home, they were writing themselves back into history. He marveled at how a letter of 3 paragraphs could carry the weight of a lifetime. Years later, those letters became testimonies. Scholars cited them in studies of cultural exchange. Survivors reread them as proof that their memories were not illusions. Families preserved them in drawers and boxes, yellowed with age but still potent. In a way, the letters outlasted the movies themselves. The reels rusted, the projectors fell silent, but the written words endured. One line, written by Aiko in 1944, still resonates today. We thought war was made of steel and fire. Then we saw that it could also be undone by laughter and light. That was the long echo. Not propaganda, not weapons, not orders, but letters written by women who had been shocked into rediscovering joy. Words traveling across oceans, shaking the very foundations of belief. When the war ended, the women carried 2 kinds of memories home. One was heavy, the humiliation of surrender, the silence of captivity, the ache of separation from family. The other was lighter, almost fragile, the laughter in a darkened room, the shimmer of a projector beam, the music of a world they had never been told existed. Returning to Japan was not a triumphant march, but a quiet, uncertain re-entry. Many stepped off ships in Yokohama or Kobe wearing worn American-issue clothes, their hair cropped short, their eyes sunken from years of hardship. Families rushed forward, yet embraces often carried an edge of suspicion. In a society still saturated with propaganda, returning POWs, especially women, were sometimes met with doubt. "What did you see?" relatives asked. "What did they do to you?" And here the strangest truth emerged. These women did not speak first of rations, or guards, or labor. They spoke of films. They described Chaplin's tramp stumbling across the screen, Gene Autry's cowboy songs, or a comedy sketch so ridiculous that the entire camp had erupted in laughter. It was a story so unexpected, so out of tune with the collective narrative of wartime suffering, that listeners either blinked in disbelief or leaned in with furtive hunger for more. One woman, Keiko, gave her testimony years later to a historian. "I could not explain the camp in words that would make sense to my neighbors. But when I said, 'They showed us movies,' I saw their faces change. They could not imagine it, and so they listened." The strangeness itself gave her credibility. No propagandist could have invented such a detail. In Kyoto, a group of repatriated nurses gathered secretly in 1946 to share experiences. They spoke of lice, hunger, humiliation, but when one hesitantly mentioned The Wizard of Oz, a ripple of recognition moved through the room. Eyes widened, then softened. Each had carried the same hidden jewel, the memory of the screen. One nurse recalled, "It was the only time I forgot I was a prisoner." Another added, "It was the first time I thought America was not only machines, but music." The room fell silent, not from shame, but from awe that each had thought her memory unique. Those recollections did not fade. Instead, they ripened with time. As Japan rebuilt, American films flooded theaters. For most citizens, it was their first exposure, but for those women, it was déjà vu. They had already met America in the flicker of light inside a camp. They sat in crowded post-war cinemas, surrounded by neighbors who gasped at the same scenes, and they felt a private, bittersweet recognition. "I had seen it before," Harumi whispered to her daughter decades later. "Not in a city, not in freedom, but in captivity." For some, the movies had been more than entertainment. They had been lifelines. Aiko wrote in her later memoir, "That first comedy kept me alive. I realized there was still such a thing as laughter. I thought if I could carry that memory home, I would not be destroyed." Her words became a touchstone for later generations, proof that even in war, small mercies could preserve the human spirit. In post-war Japan, where trauma often silenced conversation, these women's stories offered a paradoxical hope. They did not erase the brutality of war, but they revealed that humanity could flicker even inside barbed wire. Historians who collected their testimonies noticed how often they returned to a single motif: the screen, the light, the sound of laughter. It was as if those evenings had burned themselves onto memory more vividly than hunger or fear. By the 1960s, as American culture swept into Japan through jazz clubs, Hollywood imports, and television, the irony deepened. The same women who had once gasped at foreign films in captivity now watched their grandchildren imitate Elvis or hum American jingles. For them, it was not simply fashion. It was a reminder of the moment when an enemy had accidentally introduced them to another world. Not all memories were sweet. Some carried bitterness. They showed us films, one survivor said, but we were still behind wire. It was kindness inside a cage. Her words underlined the contradiction. The mercy was real, but so was the captivity. And yet even she admitted that the movies had changed something inside her. "I hated them less," she said, and that was the beginning of change. What lingers today is not the specific titles or plots, but the sensation itself. The shock of seeing joy permitted, the bewilderment of hearing music from another culture, the realization that an enemy had extended, however clumsily, a gesture of humanity. For these women, those hours in the dark carried a weight far greater than entertainment. They became symbols of survival, of reconciliation, of the stubborn endurance of the human spirit. A granddaughter of one of the prisoners once held up a yellowed letter on camera for a documentary. In it, her grandmother had written in 1945, "We laughed, even as prisoners. They let us watch a movie. It was like seeing another planet." The granddaughter's voice trembled. "I grew up watching American films every weekend, but to know she saw them first, behind wire, makes me understand both her pain and her hope." That is the paradox, the quiet lesson that outlived the war. The screen was not simply a diversion. It was a mirror. It showed women who had been stripped of freedom that the world outside was bigger than slogans and fear. It reminded them that cultures could collide not only through bombs, but through laughter. And it carried forward, generation to generation, in letters, diaries, and memories, until it became part of history itself. The echo remains. When Japanese female prisoners remembered their captivity, they remembered the movies. And when they remembered the movies, they remembered that even in the bleakest of times, light could fall on a wall, and shadows could turn into hope. Decades after the war, when historians sifted through letters, diaries, and interviews, one detail kept surfacing with surprising consistency: the movies. It was never the barbed wire they emphasized first, nor the guards, nor even the hunger. It was the screen. Scholars began to realize that the story of female prisoners in America's camps could not be told without that light flickering against makeshift walls. By the 1980s, oral historians in Japan started recording the testimonies of surviving women. Many of them were grandmothers by then, their voices softer, their memories sometimes hazy. But when asked about captivity, their faces lit with the recollection of films. They remembered titles, scenes, even fragments of dialogue. Some laughed as they spoke, others wept. One woman paused during her interview and whispered, "When I saw those films, I realized my world had been a lie." The silence after that sentence said as much as the words themselves. American historians, too, were startled. They had studied logistics, troop movements, camp construction, but rarely the psychological impact of culture on prisoners. For them, the idea that Chaplin or Judy Garland might have reshaped the perceptions of Japan's captured women was almost unbelievable, yet the evidence was too consistent to ignore. Diaries lined with sketches of movie screens, letters describing laughter in captivity, memoirs where the first remembered detail was not cruelty, but cinema. Cultural historians called it a soft fracture. It did not end the war, It did not change strategies, but it fractured propaganda. In a world where identity was shaped by slogans and fear, the sudden sight of a cowboy singing under a wide American sky opened a crack too wide to close, and from that crack spilled questions. If Americans could laugh like this, what else had been untrue? Japanese post-war society wrestled with the legacy. For some, the memories were almost embarrassing, too trivial compared to the enormity of destruction. Why talk about movies when cities had burned? But for others, the very triviality was the point. Amid devastation, the fact that prisoners remembered laughter carried symbolic weight. It proved that war, no matter how brutal, could not completely suffocate humanity. Filmmakers later revisited these testimonies. In documentaries, directors used slow pans over camp sketches, faded letters, and reels of the films that had once been shown. A projector beam cut through archival dust, and voices of survivors described their disbelief. The juxtaposition was powerful. Black and white footage of ruined Tokyo, spliced with color scenes from Hollywood musicals. The contrast told the story without words. In Germany, scholars noted a similar phenomenon with prisoners who had been exposed to American culture. But the Japanese women's case was sharper, because their society had been more tightly sealed from Western media before the war. For them, the impact of cinema was not a shift, it was an earthquake. Seeing America not as slogans, but as songs and faces was a revelation with lifelong consequences. Children and grandchildren of those women often discovered these stories late. In family archives, they found letters describing films in captivity. Some thought them fanciful, even invented, until historians confirmed the details. That realization created an intergenerational bridge. Descendants suddenly saw their elders not only as victims of war, but as young women shocked into laughter in the unlikeliest of places. Museums in both Japan and the United States eventually displayed fragments of this story. Exhibits on POW life included projectors, film reels, even Red Cross documents mentioning entertainment. Visitors stared at them, astonished. It seemed too strange to be true, that a war defined by firebombs and surrender could also include nights of comedy films under guard. Yet the artifacts proved it. The legacy is complex. On one hand, it shows the power of culture as a weapon, unintended but potent. On the other, it testifies to resilience. Prisoners reclaimed part of their humanity by laughing at moving pictures. Historians now argue that these screenings were more than distraction. They were moments of cultural diplomacy, accidental bridges across a chasm of hate. A Japanese scholar summarized it simply in a lecture. These women did not remember the barbed wire first. They remembered the screen. And that tells us something important. The human mind clings to light when surrounded by darkness. The echo continues. Every retelling of their story reminds us that war is never only steel, fire, and fear. It is also memory, shaped by the smallest details. A projector bulb, a reel of film, a moment of laughter. Those details outlived empires. They outlived propaganda. They even outlived the prisoners themselves, because their letters and voices carry forward into archives, classrooms, and museums. The women who once sat in shock before American films never imagined their stories would become history, yet they did. And in that history lies a truth sharper than any weapon. Culture can change perception, even in captivity, even in war. The screen flickered, the laughter rose, and a myth collapsed. The war had ended long ago, but memory lingers like an after-image when the projector bulb is switched off. For the Japanese women who lived behind American wire, what remained was not only the hunger or the roll calls, not only the sting of loss. What clung most fiercely was the light. A flickering screen in a makeshift hall, a sudden burst of laughter, the shock of realizing that the enemy could offer joy instead of fear. History often reduces conflict to maps and battles, to lines drawn across oceans and continents. But these women carried a different record, one made of sound and motion. They remembered Judy Garland's voice, Chaplin's stumble, the absurdity of a pie fight in a world otherwise defined by steel helmets and ration tins. It was not grand strategy, yet it mattered, because in that darkness, under guard, they saw a truth that propaganda had buried. America was not only machines and bombs. It was people, singing and laughing, showing glimpses of their lives through stories on film. The paradox was sharp. These women had been enemies, stripped of freedom, placed in captivity, and yet the very people who guarded them allowed them to laugh again. That contradiction unsettled them at first, then slowly transformed into something deeper. For many, the memory of those movies became the first step toward questioning the myths they had been raised on. The screen did not erase the war, but it reframed it. Years later, as grandmothers, they told their children and grandchildren about the strange nights when the lights dimmed and America appeared larger than life. Their stories were met with surprise, sometimes disbelief, but always fascination. Because within those stories lay a profound reminder. Humanity does not vanish in war. It hides, it flickers, and sometimes it returns in the most unexpected forms. For historians, the detail is more than anecdote. It shows the quiet power of culture in shaping perception. Bombs destroy, but stories endure. Propaganda blinds, but laughter clears a path to doubt. And doubt is often the beginning of change. The Japanese women who once sat rigid with fear discovered through film a world beyond slogans. And once seen, it could never be unseen. In the end, the movies were not just diversions. They were symbols of survival, of resilience, of the fragile threads of humanity stretched across enemy lines. A flicker of light on a wall became a bridge, fragile yet real, connecting two worlds that war had tried to tear apart. The final lesson is simple. Steel and fire may win battles, but it is memory that endures. And in the memory of these women, what lasted longest was not the clang of barbed wire, but the sound of laughter echoing in captivity.